Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Iron Coffins, Epilogue. The armistice ended the war on May 5th, 1945, but I still had to fight for another 6 months before I won the battle for my life. The collapse of Germany hit me especially hard. I felt betrayed and misled. After Hitler's death, the dissolution of the order we had recognized and the disbandment of the Wehrmacht, I concluded that I was released from my oath to the Führer. Everything that had been dear to me was dead. My only thought was to be free and to remain so. But between me and freedom lay the power of the Allied occupation. I was convinced that all of us who had fought for Germany would be subjected to disgraceful captivity and humiliating interrogations. I refused to acknowledge the arrogance of the Allied occupation troops, who either had to be confused by the enormous task or extremely vengeful towards their former enemies. I was determined to flee to find my own peace. I vowed to myself that nothing could stop me from doing exactly what I wanted to do. In the days after the capitulation, I found no reason to trust the victorious powers. The British continued their attacks on our last submarines, which had escaped from German ports and were on their way to Norway. I concluded that they would continue their extermination for an indefinite period. I spent my hardest time down at the pier and on Fred Schreiber's boat and had the opportunity to greet a few boats that came in heavily damaged. Eckel from U-2325 and Wex from U-2354 reported, still in shock, that 5 more boats had been sunk in the Great Belt and the Skagerrak. This brought the number of boats destroyed after the armistice to 16, bringing the total losses of submarines since the beginning of the war to 779. May the 7th was a day when hysteria reigned unchecked. The Norwegian population celebrated their liberation with exuberance. In the process, it happened that 3 sailors from the base near the city were found drunk and were about to tear off their insignia with their teeth. Their brief excursion into the new world quickly came to an end when the base chief, Captain Jürgensen, coming from the city, arrested the shouting men and drove them back in his car. During an immediate investigation, it was reported that the arrested men had stockpiled weapons and, according to statements from other base soldiers, had tried to incite comrades to mutiny. As a result, the 3 apprehended were chained in the basement of the administration building and a court-martial was ordered. Moreover, an English corvette landed in the port of Kristiansand, which fueled wild rumors of an imminent occupation of the submarine base. Against this hectic backdrop, I tried to persuade Fred Schreiber to flee with me to South America. Although initially skeptical and reluctant, he finally agreed. We would sneak out of the harbor with his small boat and some of his men, snorkel along the Norwegian coast to Trondheim, and there board U-953, which had to be lying somewhere at a pier waiting for me. We would try to provision it with supplies and fill it with fuel, and then secretly slip away with the men I had selected and break through to Argentina. We set the time for our nocturnal escape and mentally prepared ourselves for an exciting journey. Before we put our plan into action, we were taken up by Captain Jürgensen's measures. Night had already fallen over the Skerries and plunged the base into deep darkness when all the soldiers and crews of the boats lying at the pier were ordered to the square in front of the small shipyard. Fred and I followed the men from his boat through the night blue air. Dismay paralyzed our steps as we entered the dimly lit square. The submarine crews were assembled in a horseshoe shape facing the whitewashed wall of the workshop building, with their front turned toward a makeshift gallows. 3 grotesque white nooses hung from a steel frame, illuminated by the flickering light of a ship's lantern. Under the nooses stood a large table on which 3 stools were lined up, 1 stool for each knot, the substitute for the trapdoor. In front of this primitive gallows stood a second table, covered with a war flag. It glowed blood red in the light of the ship's lantern that stood on one side of the table, and on the other side lay a book, Hitler's Mein Kampf. In the middle lay a naval sword. A group of armed base soldiers took up position behind this stage. Officers of the flotilla staff hurried back and forth. Jürgensen's adjutant nervously gave orders. The crowd fell into an oppressive silence. Captain Jürgensen stepped into the circle of light from the lantern. His face shone brightly in the lamp's glow as he began to speak. "Soldiers, I have called you together to show you how we will avoid a new 1918. In our navy, we have no place for revolutionaries. I will administer the punishment that the court sees fit for the 3 ringleaders we caught in the city today. It will serve as a lesson for anyone entertaining revolutionary ideas. We will know how to protect and uphold our ideals. Guards, bring these men to justice." What followed was a nightmare turning into harsh reality. The prisoners were hauled out of the basement and led through the dark pine forest. With hands tied behind their backs, they were pushed one by one into the bright square. Then, sudden terror. They saw the gallows with its white nooses swaying. Insane comprehension of imminent death followed, which was in turn followed by immediate paralysis, which in turn was followed by immediate action. All the prisoners turned, they broke free and ran into the dark pine thicket. The adjutant drew his pistol and shot one of the men, a mate, multiple times in the back. The man stumbled and fell on his face. The other two figures were quickly surrounded, captured, and brought back to the gallows, along with the mate. The adjutant positioned himself before the crews and the few officers from the boats, who silently observed the proceedings and called out a long list of accusations into the still night. At the end of his breathlessly received speech, he finally demanded the harshest punishment: death by hanging. Then Captain Jurgensen stepped back into the lantern's light and behind the table with the blood-red flag. With deliberate words, he asked the assembled crews whether they found the sentences in accordance with the accusations just. Their reaction gave him the power to decide over the accused's life or death, and he sentenced the 3 soldiers to execution by hanging until death separates the soul from the body. The guards were ordered to carry out the sentence. The mate and supposed ringleader, who had been hanging in the arms of 2 armed sailors during the accusations and sentencing, suddenly came back to life. With bullets in his body, he fought free and with a few leaps jumped into the ranks of the crew. The other 2 accused, taking advantage of their guard's surprise, started to run. Shots were fired, screams, stomping, dust was stirred up. Curses, blows, tumult. The dim light of the lantern illuminated a scene of raw savagery. With superhuman strength, the condemned men fought, shoved, and ran for their lives. But soon they were surrounded and overpowered. Captain Jurgensen, recognizing the impossibility of carrying out his command to the letter, changed the sentence from death by hanging to death by firing squad. The guards heard the order, and then everything happened very quickly. One guard raised his rifle and shot the mate at point-blank range. His face flew off like a pancake. Seconds later, the other 2 condemned men, riddled with bullets, collapsed. The soldiers dragged the bodies to the white wall of the workshop, where a medical officer confirmed their deaths. The court-martial was declared over. The boat crews were dismissed. The guards marched away. After midnight, 2 non-commissioned officers helped me lift the 3 corpses into a rowboat. That was all I could do for the dead. We attached heavy weights to the necks and feet of the executed men, rowed the boat into the middle of the dark fjord, and then 3 splashes on the water, and the dead sailors had their sea burial. The base commander's warning did not miss its mark. Faced with this drastic measure, Fred decided not to set sail that night or any other, and so my fate remained tied to Germany. For the next few days, the base was enveloped in deadly silence. We awaited the victors. The court-martial shattered my last hope. If Germans could shoot Germans without hesitation, there could be no future in Germany, and we could expect no mercy from the conquerors. But, to everyone's surprise, the victors showed no interest in us or our boats at the base. They did not even sink those who complied with the order to surrender with a black flag hoisted on the periscope. My fears were further alleviated when I had my first encounter with a British officer. It was mid-May. I had orders to make contact with the British district commander in a small town east of Kristiansand. My task was to negotiate the evacuation of the naval personnel from the base with the victors. I set out in a lightly armored vehicle, 2 sailors with loaded submachine guns sat in the backseat. Before departure, I had been warned of a possible ambush by a Norwegian underground movement. But, without firing a single shot, I arrived at a small village hotel and found Colonel MacGregor in a room on the 2nd floor, who greeted me wearing only sports shorts. MacGregor closed the door and offered me a chair. "I've just taken my morning exercise," he said apologetically in a Scottish accent. "I go for a run every day to keep in a good shape. A man my age must watch his weight." I estimated him to be around 40 years old. He was of medium height, strongly built, with reddish blonde hair. To my surprise, MacGregor grabbed 2 glasses, filled them with wine, handed me one and said, "It's the best stuff I could find in this damn town." While he put on his field uniform, MacGregor told me a fascinating story. 3 months earlier, he had parachuted into the Norwegian mountains and organized the resistance of the population and the underground movements. While we were on our last enemy missions feeling safe in the fjords, and some posts considered the continuation of the fight in Norway possible, he had already initiated total resistance and effective sabotage. Then he got to the main point of our meeting. We were to evacuate our bases within 3 days. All naval units in and around Kristiansand had to withdraw to the nearby island of Trømøy in an orderly formation. For the time being, he emphasized, we could keep our weapons. Impressed by MacGregor's ease, I concluded that it was neither dishonorable nor degrading to submit to such an officer. On the evening before the departure, I went down to the pier where the U-boats were still moored. For the last time, I looked at the grey wolves that had been the essence of my career. I knew I would never board a U-boat again. The bitter realization that all my efforts had been in vain and all sacrifices had been for nothing made me melancholy. I quickly turned around and went back to my room. In the heat of a May day, thousands of sailors and U-boatmen streamed across the bridge into the well-kept barracks on Trömö. The island had served for years as quarters for a regiment of German coastal batteries. Our men were accommodated in clean barracks. Fred Schreiber and I joined a group of naval officers and took up residence in a well-maintained farmhouse that had once served as the officers' mess. The complete absence of British troops and our undisturbed settling in closed groups gave rise to the idea that our stay on Trömö would be a short and pleasant affair. But soon the opposite would prove true. Despite our self-imposed daily routine, which included orderly activities like sports, classes and an early lights out, the hours and days dragged on slowly and tediously. Rumors, fantastic reports and wild speculations about the collapse at home in Germany and our own future spread like wildfire in the camp. When it became known that Hitler had not, as we had been told, fallen fighting on the barricades in Berlin as a soldier, but had cowardly escaped from the chaos and taken his own life, the last pillar of our dream world collapsed. While we had thrown our lives into battles for him and the nation, believing in his idea, the Führer had ruthlessly driven us into total collapse. Hitler's suicide was a mockery of our deeds, our achievements, a mockery of our millions of sacrifices. Instead of being under the special protection of the Führer, as our officer's commission assured, we had been hopelessly at the mercy of our enemies. Now we had to fend for ourselves. The cause of our misfortune had chosen to leave the consequences to us. On one of the long evenings of a midsummer night, I sat on the red rocks of Trömö and wrote my anguish from my heart. The poem read as such. We were young, we believed and endured everything. We fought bitterly and bravely. We suffered and were shattered without complaining. We hoped and showed loyalty without questioning. We fought until we were all slain. We obeyed, but you elders betrayed us all. Under the pressure of defeat and the announcement of atrocities and the dismemberment of our homeland, many lost their balance. And there were others who simply broke down. On one of those bright nights, an officer comrade hanged himself in the attic of our house. We buried him among the rocks of Trömö. Uncertainty, sensitivity and resentment grew steadily as the days stretched into weeks and we heard nothing from the English about our future or our transport back to Germany. About 3 weeks after our arrival on the island, a rebellion suddenly broke out in one of the barracks. Soldiers who claimed to be neither Germans nor border Germans and had been pressed into military service rebelled against their captivity. They barricaded themselves in their quarters and shot one of our officers who tried to assess the situation. The mutiny lasted only 1 day and came to a quick, unheroic end when British troops surrounded the barracks and transported the insurgents away in trucks. 2 nights later, the English returned. We were startled from our sleep by much shouting and gunfire, herded together on a meadow and ordered to strip naked. While some Tommies searched our quarters for weapons, we walked through a gauntlet of bayonets in the nude. Our nudity was a calculated insult. It erased the distinction between officers and men and made it clear to all of us that our submission was unconditional. The Tommies found little that interested them, and after shooting up our rooms in Wild West fashion out of frustration, they left as suddenly as they had come. In the early days of July, they returned, this time to set up an examination commission in the open air. We were asked to register for eventual dispatch to our homeland. Delighted by the new prospects, I gave the Englishman all the information he wanted. For my desired place of release, I named Frankfurt without hesitation. It was the only place where I could start a new life, even though I had no other connections in the city than sad memories and bank account with worthless currency. After the commission left Trömö, everything was as quiet as before. Nothing happened. 2 more weeks of almost unbearable waiting let our hopes sink lower and lower. But on July the 24th, the decision came. A detachment of English troops swarmed through the camp and instructed those of us who had registered for release in the French and American occupation zones to board the provided barges. A 1-day journey by water along the cliff-ridged coast brought us to Mandal. Upon disembarking, we were surrounded by a mixed English-Norwegian unit behaving alarmingly warlike and herded behind heavily guarded barbed wire fences. That night, we slept in a Norwegian cornfield in English tents, our bellies filled with a warm Irish stew for the first time in many weeks. The next morning followed a long chain of inspections and interrogations. To put us in the most disadvantageous position possible and to rule out deception, we had to strip down to the skin again. Then they brought us one by one to a nearby barn for questioning. My inquisitor was an English officer about 40 years old. For the first time, I was asked questions that I answered honestly and that would be asked of me many times in the future. What was your last position in the Kriegsmarine? Submarine captain. I thought we had exterminated every one of you. How many ships did you sink? I didn't keep count. Come on now, didn't you report your sinkings? Of course, but I didn't keep a record of them. Does that mean you're denying responsibility for your actions? Sir, I did my duty. I stand by that. Well, let's not argue about it. We did manage to thin out your ranks quite a bit, didn't we? There may be about a dozen commanders still alive, including 2 or 3 who, like me, survived most of the war. Were you a member of the Nazi Party? No. Were you a member of the Hitler Youth? No. Were you a member of any party affiliate organization? No. Nonsense. All Germans say that nowadays. You must have been a member of at least one Nazi organization. How else could you become a naval officer and rise to a submarine captain? Come on now, admit you are a member of the Hitler Youth. Sorry to disappoint you, but you are misinformed. The Kriegsmarine did not recruit its officers from the Hitler Youth. Membership in the party was also not a requirement for joining the Kriegsmarine. We had to meet the same qualifications as those required by the Royal Navy. I know better. I must warn you, tell the truth. Any false answer will be severely punished. You'd better admit your membership and save yourself a lot of trouble. We have seized all the party records and it's easy for us to find out the truth. These are the facts, sir. I have nothing to add. The Englishman broke off his questioning and reached for a thick book, the Allies' criminal record. After searching in vain for my name, he asked how I had managed to survive the war at sea. For a long time, he listened to my explanations and then stamped my discharge papers. He handed them to me with a crooked smile and said pointedly, "Take good care of these papers. Without them, you'll end up behind barbed wire. And, Captain, good luck." At sunset, I stood at the railing of a dirty old freighter that was taking us back to Germany. Several thousand sailors with crackling discharge papers in their pockets swarmed the deck and watched the Norwegian coast slowly disappear. There was no laughter, no cheerfulness, only a subdued silence and tense anticipation. The next morning, July the 26th, we were all on deck. The sun rose and the sky was clear. The North Sea breathed calmly as the steamer cautiously entered the wide estuary of the Weser. The port traffic increased the further we advanced towards Bremerhaven. Then 2 tugboats came alongside and guided the sluggish freighter to a pier. Suddenly, a jarring awakening. American soldiers in olive green uniforms jumped out of waiting vehicles and barricaded the pier. We were all speechless as we disembarked and set foot on German soil. Our English discharge papers were collected. Still dazed from the whole ordeal, we were loaded onto trucks, driven to a camp outside Bremerhaven, deloused and ushered into an empty cage. Night fell over the camp without tents and over several thousand German soldiers who had been released by the English and recaptured by the Americans. Fred and I shared a tin of sardines from his dwindling ship's stock and some biscuits we had saved on Trömøy, rolled ourselves in our blankets and soon fell into a light sleep under the stars. July the 27th. At dawn we, 3,000 men, were herded like cattle into a waiting open freight train bound for Frankfurt, as we were assured, where our English papers would receive an American stamp and we would be discharged. It was a long, slow, sad journey in the open, windy, soot-covered freight cars. We passed through wheat fields ripe for harvest, through destroyed cities and towns, past idyllic villages and crossroads guarded and secured by the conquerors, along highways where American artillery, tanks and motorized columns were backed up, through mountains of rubble that had once been German cities. We reached Frankfurt late in the afternoon of the second day of our journey. As the long line of our open cars rolled through the suburbs and then along the Schaumann-Kai, I took in the bitter fact that my hometown had been destroyed beyond recognition and had become an American garrison. The train stopped at the quay in the midst of the once flourishing Nizza Park. I asked one of the 5 American sentries where and when we would be discharged. The corporal had no specific instructions, but indicated that we would have to remain in our freight cars until we reached Höchst. Soon the train started moving again, winding through switches and a tangle of tracks, leaving Frankfurt behind, rolling through Höchst and continuing westwards into the evening. Then the Rhine Valley opened up, and with sudden dismay I realized that we had been deceived. With a jolt, the train stopped west of Rüdesheim. Shots, excitement, clashing of weapons, engine noise. French troops swarmed the train. A voice spoke in fluent German over the loudspeaker. "Get your heads down, this is the French army. We will shoot at the slightest sign of disobedience, and we shoot well. Stay calm and follow our orders." Shock, mad incapacity to act. We had been sold and captured. At this point I knew that the thought of freedom had been nothing but a dream. The reality was captivity and barbed wire. We cursed and bitterly lamented our unlawful surrender to the French, but there was no one to hear our complaints. The night was as silent as a tomb. No one slept. We sat in our open cars, surrounded by the victors, illuminated by floodlights and held in check by threatening gun barrels. July the 29th. Dawn. Suddenly, the Marseillaise echoed through the Rhine Valley. And again, a voice, this time with an Alsatian accent, spoke over the loudspeaker. "Get out of the cars immediately, form 3 ranks at the riverbank. Do not attempt to escape, it would be fatal. Allez, allez, hop!" 3,000 Germans who had never fought against the French began their journey into captivity. We assembled at the riverbank, then recrossed a swaying pontoon bridge over the Rhine into the French occupation zone. Driven by a shouting, gesticulating unit of French troops, we marched through the morning heat. By midday, we were parched, thirsty, and exhausted from the unfamiliar march. Dusty and deeply demoralized, we dragged ourselves through a decorated triumphal arch into the notorious camp of Dietersheim. A horse-drawn car leaving the camp shoved us aside. It was filled with emaciated and naked corpses. Glinting bayonets separated us officers from the men and shoved us into a gigantic cage filled with bearded, ragged figures. Wandering skeletons, nearly naked and decrepit, with long matted hair and beards, skin deeply tanned and hardened like leather and cracked from malnutrition, greeted us. These prisoners had lived and slept outdoors for months and had made their homes in holes in the ground. Rain would turn the bare earth into a lake of mud and bury the men in their own graves that they had dug with their hands. Fred and I chose an abandoned hole, buried our watches, rings and other valuables in the dust, and waited for what would come next. I noticed that our guards were Moroccan soldiers. They constantly threw hand grenades and, for their amusement, fired bursts of machine guns over our heads. In the late afternoon, a cart with aluminum cans was driven into our cage. It contained our first meal since the Irish stew. We were told that the liquid in the cans was soup, but it looked and tasted like dirty dishwater. I turned away in disgust and told Fred determinedly that I wasn't going to sit around here and eventually wither away to a skeleton. I was determined to escape. That very night I began my desperate fight for freedom. As darkness settled over the barren ground, I left my hole. The arc lamps on the perimeter of the vast camp cast an eerie glow. Flat in the dust, I slowly crawled through the first obstacle, a 3-meter-high barbed wire fence, into no man's land. In this narrow space between 2 parallel fences which separated the officer's cage from that of the non-commissioned officers, I slithered and crawled carefully, often stopping and crouching toward the brightly illuminated double fence of the outer wire fence. Holding my breath, I inched closer to the illuminated zone, shifting between 2 machine gun nests in the high watchtowers on the other side of no man's land, pressing my face into the dust, 2-3 moves, and I lay in the thin shadow of the corner post of the inner perimeter fence. Motionless, I remained in a narrow, dark strip that the arc lamps couldn't reach. My breathing was rapid, my pulse was pounding, and my tongue was sticking to the roof of my mouth. In front of me lay the fire line between the inner and outer fence, the last obstacle. A roll of barbed wire blocked the way. Beyond the fence, in a dim light of the arc lamps, the outside world was visible. The grass by the fence had been mowed to a width of about 25 meters, but behind it, in the surreal darkness, tall grass or a grain field promised protection and cover. Minutes passed. Perhaps an entire hour went by. I lay there, listening and observing. At long intervals, machine gun bursts shattered the silence of the night. A hand grenade exploded far off. Guards patrolled the firing fields, calls echoed from the watchtowers into the night. My eyes took in every detail. Then I spotted a dark zone in the fire line between the 2 fences, a triangular shadow caused by 2 arc lamps that were too far apart. That was the spot for my escape. Here I would crawl through no man's land, squeeze through the roll of barbed wire, and overcome the outer fence. I didn't think about the bullets that might hit me, nor about what would happen if I were caught tangled in the barbed wire. Out there was freedom, and I had to reach it. I glanced at my watch. I had spent over 3 hours crawling and observing. It was already too late for an attempt. I decided to make my escape the following night and slowly crawled back into the twilight of the lamps, made my way along the inner fences to the depths of the camp where darkness swallowed me. When I jumped into my hole, a bright streak in the east heralded the new day. The sound of the Marseillaise jolted me from my first sleep. I told Fred about my discovery, and to my surprise, Fred did not share my enthusiasm. He was convinced that our captivity was a misunderstanding, that things soon would be clarified, and that we would be released by the weekend. But I saw our imprisonment for what it was and feared a years-long detention that might end in the jungles of Guyana. I stuck to my plan, gave Fred a Frankfurt address where he could find me if he decided to escape later, and prepared for my breakout. The hours dragged on slowly, the heat increased, shimmering above the parched earth, making the emaciated bodies of the old prisoners even more withered. I understood the misery in its full extent and knew that only escape could save me from starvation. I moved like in a trance to the cage, considered every move for the night, gave my soup to one of the doomed, and contented myself with the last of the biscuits I had saved from turmoil. When night fell over the Nile Valley, I began to crawl again. It was 9:30 p.m. Long, breathless creeping. Cautiously, I made my way into the narrow shadow of the corner post of the inner fence. Again, only the roll of barbed wire and the last hurdle, the outer fence, lay before me. I remained indecisive for minutes. Then I forced myself to act. Inch by inch, I crawled into the dark zone between the two arc lamps. Flattened against the ground, teeth clenched with a pulse pounding like hammer blows, I slid through the fire zone. Every second could bring a burst of machine gun fire. I stretched my arms forward, dug my fingers into the earth, and dragged my body after me. Sweat poured from every pore, ran into my eyes, drenched my clothes. Then I touched the roll of barbed wire, carefully parted the wire slowly and silently to create an opening. I crawled through the tangle, and suddenly lay outside of the outer fence. Silence, eerie calm. I took a deep breath, glanced at the watchtowers, pushed myself under the lowest wire of the fence, slipped through, slowly let go of the wire, and was free. I slowly rolled over onto my side, not a sound, no reaction from the towers. Then I rolled like a wheel away from the lights and the lamps, across the fire zone, further and further from the fence and into the deep grass and darkness. I had made it. Silence. No shots had been fired. I crept through meadows and fields, approaching a village in the Nile Valley, about 3 kilometers south of the camp. With my shoes in my hand, I walked barefoot over the cobblestones, slipped into the shadows of the buildings deeper into the village, and threw myself onto a bale of hay in a barn, falling immediately into a deep sleep. A sharp sound awoke me. I peered through a crack in the door and saw a farmer harnessing his horses. I opened the creaking door, hurried over to him, and confessed without preamble that I had escaped from the camp and needed help. The farmer was more than surprised. The feat of escaping from the camp, he told me, had so far only been achieved by prisoners who had written themselves out under the pressure of the Foreign Legion. He quickly took me to the kitchen, where his wife and daughter soon served me a huge breakfast with eggs, bacon, and fried potatoes. Between bites, catching my breath, I gave my helpers a brief account of my military past and unusual capture. Their concern for my questionable freedom extended so far that the farmer offered to obtain identification papers for me and Fred. "Without papers," he warned, "you'll be arrested at the next crossroads and end up behind the same barbed wire from which you tore yourself out." Soon, I was in a zinc bathtub in the barn, washing the camp's grime off my body, cleaning my clothes, and letting my skin and shirt dry in the sun. Long before the day ended, I crawled into a soft bed that smelled of strong soap and covered myself with a down comforter as big as a balloon. After a refreshing sleep, I woke with renewed strength and an unshakable resolve to get Fred out of the camp. Although the farmer and his wife considered the risk too high, they provided me with bread, potatoes, pastries, jam, sausage, and some packets of American cigarettes for the comrades who had to stay behind. After nightfall, I slung the sack over my shoulder and marched through the dark blue air, through meadows and fields towards the brightly lit camp. 200 meters from the fence, I lay flat on the ground again and crawled slowly, keeping an eye out in all directions, towards the arc lights. As the silhouettes of the watchtowers appeared above the tall grass, I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. But for a few seconds, I was overwhelmed by the futility of my actions, which could end with my execution in the tangled barbed wire. Then I continued crawling, dragging the sack with a leather strap. Suddenly, voices, very close. Steps in the tall grass. 2 Moroccan soldiers stood before me like giant shadows. I was caught. I immediately got up and awaited the inevitable. But, to my surprise, the 2 sentries were more interested in the contents of my sack than in me personally. A brief conversation, and I saw my chance. Since my French was better than that of the desert soldiers, I easily convinced them of my harmless mission. That I was merely trying to smuggle food to the hungry prisoners. I casually lit an American cigarette and offered the uniformed riff guards the rest of the pack. With greedy fingers, both reached for the coveted cigarettes, and I gave them a light. With that, I had control of the situation. I promised them a regular supply of American cigarettes in exchange for their help in letting me pass through the barbed wire at will. The craving for tobacco prevailed. They quickly grabbed the second pack of Camels, led me to the guard tower at the corner where I offered a third pack to the sentry on the platform, then they opened the fence and held it open while I squeezed through with my sack. A practiced crouch, a quick movement, and I had the second fence behind me. A wave of my free hand, and I vanished into the relative darkness of the camp. I jumped into the hole that I had shared with Fred. He woke from a deep sleep, first dazed, then speechless at my return. He reached into the sack, pulled out a piece of peasant bread, and bit into it. With growing anger, I realized that he was more interested in the culinary blessings than in an escape which had lost all danger due to my bribery. He insisted that he would have his release papers with a French stamp by Saturday and that all the comrades from Norway were of the same opinion. Disappointed by the collapse of my plan, I left Fred, the dying and the hopeless, with the provisions but extracted his promise that he would follow me in the night if things changed. My last pack of camels secured my retreat from the camp. An hour later, I was back in the barn, throwing myself exhausted onto the bale of hay. For 2 days, I enjoyed life on this very farm. I helped the farmer with his work in the fields, raked the hay, and loaded it onto the wagons. I ate the hearty meals with unusual appetite, bathed in the zinc tub in the barn after sunset, and was quite content with my fate. I had discovered that freedom could be gained in a single bold moment. Saturday evening arrived, then the night. Fred had not found his way to freedom, either legally or illegally. His hopes destroyed, I hoped to find him in the necessary condition to take the decisive step. Determined to spare him the fate of incarceration, I set out for the camp. Everything was so simple. Again, I was equipped with American cigarettes, met the same sentries who eagerly accepted the camels, and squeezed through the same barbed wire which had proven to be so easily overcome by now. But once inside the enclosure, I was alarmed by the frenzied scurrying of shadowy figures. I approached Fred's camp with curiosity, and then I was suddenly surrounded by figures and shoved into the earth hole. With searing terror, I realized that I was being held captive by my own comrades. From the confused conversations, I gathered what had happened in the afternoon. During a surprise roll call, I was reported as present. However, when the French camp commander announced after the roll call that all reinforcements from Norway would be shipped to France and that for every missing man at the end of the journey 5 soldiers would be shot, my fellow officers suddenly found themselves in a desperate situation. Instead of accepting the threat for what it was or informing the camp commander and reporting my escape, they relied on my promise to Fred. I could not forgive the betrayal by my fellow prisoners and drew a sharp line between myself and my comrades of yesterday at this very moment. At sunrise, and to the sounds of the Marseillaise again, I was driven with 4,000 prisoners onto the camp road. Under the watch of Senegalese troops lining the exit rows, we were herded through a corridor of bayonets, rushed through a German landscape, and loaded into 42 cattle cars that were waiting on a sidetrack. 100 men were crammed into each of the stinking closed cars, and the roll door was shut. Under the blazing summer sun, the long train set off. The suffocating heat, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the stench of manure turned the cattle car into a torture chamber. The situation gave my desire for freedom renewed energy. While the freight train with its human cargo rumbled and slowly rolled westward, I sat at the back of the car and sawed through the planks with a Boy Scout knife. I sawed in rhythm with the clattering of the wheels as they clicked over the rail joints. I sawed carefully, cautiously, and secretly. While the fellow prisoners lay around, dumbly half-stunned by the stench, thirst, and hunger, I prepared my escape. By dusk, I had completed half of my work. Around midnight, I removed a piece of the rear wall. The resulting opening was large enough to crawl through, and soon the train slowed down. That was the opportune moment. I pushed my head and upper body through the gap into the cool night air. But then I was suddenly grabbed by the feet. I kicked and fought desperately in the worst possible position. I was pulled back into the car and overwhelmed by a dozen shadowy figures. Once again, I was the prisoner of my comrades from yesterday. The journey into misery continued. It lasted the whole night, another day, and the next night. No one opened the door, no one gave us water or food. The stench of manure, urine, and human excrement hung like a dense cloud in the cattle car. Men vomited, writhed under the attacks of dysentery. One of the skeletons died on the second night, another one the following morning. The smell of decay, death, and human dissolution became unbearable. My breathing was labored. I stood up and pressed my face against the barred opening. Then I smelled the sea. The locomotive hissed, slowing down. Lush, almost tropical foliage grew along a railway line. A squeal of 100 brakes and a jolt. The train came to a stop beside an improvised platform. A company of regular French soldiers swarmed the cars, rifles and machine guns at the ready. A shrill sound, the door was pushed back. Shouts, cries, orders in French, which no one understood or wanted to understand. Stumbling, we fell out of the cars. Most of us dragged ourselves into the platform with limp limbs. Total resignation to fate, doubtful astonishment, or the imminent death showed on their faces. Under blows from rifle butts, shouting, and bayonet thrusts, we trudged through moss-covered forest ground into a hidden camp resembling a colonial jungle fortress. With the practiced eyes of a hunted animal, I immediately looked for an escape route. But the camp swallowed me along with the mass of the damned. We officers were separated from the men again and moved into a cage in the northeast corner of the camp. We were hastily registered and assigned to a large warehouse. Along with Fred, I occupied a wooden double bunk. I took the lower, Fred the upper half. There was neither a straw mattress nor a straw underlay. But there were over 4,000 new arrivals who seemed satisfied with these changed conditions. Without further hesitation, I made a reconnaissance of the cage. The camp, as I quickly learned from the old inmates, was located between Le Mans and Nantes, near the village of La Flèche. A heavily fortified double outer fence with overhanging security wires, several barbed wire barriers, strong arc lamps, rotating searchlights and guard towers manned by regular, very young French troops who could not be bribed with American cigarettes made the camp escape-proof. I realized that I had to prepare for a slow decline behind barbed wire with minimal rations. The days dragged on in heat and hunger. I made endless rounds through the cage, desperately searching for a way to freedom. For hours, I lay naked in the shadow of the latrines near the corner tower and the fence, observing the habits of the guards. At night, when the heat subsided, I crawled along the wire fences and arc lamps, slipped out of the beam of the rotating searchlights, and climbed over the fences of the adjacent cages for non-commissioned officers and enlisted men. To no avail. There was no escape. Although I did not give up the idea of fleeing, I outwardly adapted to camp life. I drank the brown beet broth as a meager substitute for coffee in the morning, slurped the dirty water with traces of grass when the sun was at its zenith, and received the 5 pieces of ship's biscuit in the afternoon, which I chewed and rechewed with ritual slowness, finally washing down with a few sips of bean coffee, which Fred knew how to make like a medicine man from the beans he conjured from the seams of his backpack. But after 2 weeks, my cheeks were hollow and my ribs were frighteningly prominent under the leathery skin. I despised those who had put me in this situation, as well as those who had apathetically resigned to their fate. Hunger was greater than friendship, stronger than prayers, deadlier than disease. Ruthless behavior amongst the prisoners was as common as dying. Rings, watches, clothing, and gold teeth were exchanged for food and tobacco. Food rations were bartered for damp cigarette butts. There were traitors, thieves, religious and political fanatics, lunatics and weaklings, but few who seriously considered escaping. After 3 weeks of restless searching, I accidentally found the escape route. My plan was so simple that I feared it might be discovered prematurely by the French. I had been observing a group of our soldiers for days. Each morning, they would regularly come to our cage, collect the heavy barrels from the latrines, carry them under guard out of the camp, and empty them into duck pits near the north gate. After 30 minutes, the pitiable skeletons would return with the empty barrels. My plan was for Fred and me to join the work detail, march out of the camp with one of the barrels, and instead of returning, disappear into the adjacent forest. The plan was simple, but its execution could be deadly. Our first escape attempt failed the following morning. As we left the cage with the work detail, we had skillfully removed all military insignia from our uniforms, we were recognized by a young Austrian lieutenant who alerted the guards. Fortunately, I was able to spare Fred and myself from 2 months of solitary confinement. The incident forced me to modify my plan. That night, between midnight and dawn, I slipped out of the darkened barracks into the yard. The camp was eerily silent. The yard lay deserted. I dashed into the shadow of the nearest building, jumped the fence that separated our cage from that of the non-commissioned officers, climbed up, swung over, and vanished into the latrine. Seconds later, Fred joined me. At dawn, the camp came to life. We waited tensely for 2 hours. Then the work detail appeared. Fred and I lifted a barrel from its holder, joined the group, and marched unnoticed out of the NCO's cage onto the White Camp Road. With a rising pulse, we trudged under the load of human excrement, past the camp gate, the guard towers, and dragged our barrel to the farthest pit. A quick look around, no suspicious movements from the guards. No alarming concentration of submachine guns. Everything seemed normal. We quickly crouched behind the large barrel. A bold decision, and I fell flat on the ground, crawled into the tall ferns, and crept on hands, knees, and toes towards the nearby forest, expecting the sharp crack of a rifle at any moment. Then I was in the underbrush, 2 or 3 more yards, and I was standing behind a massive fir tree. Deciduous trees blocked my view. A few heartbeats later, there was a rustling. It was Fred. We immediately pushed deeper into the thicket. But everything remained still, improbably still. We pressed through dense undergrowth, raced through the forest, crossed brooks and forest paths, and continued westward, deeper into the woods. After 3 hours of battling thorns, branches, and underbrush, we collapsed exhausted into a thicket. Here, we found some berries. They calmed our stomach nerves, but couldn't quench our thirst. Heat, thirst, and pests turned our rest into hell. At dusk, we crept towards the direction from which we had heard the sound of engines. Refreshed by the coolness of the night, we entered the road and marched east, always east, where Germany had to be. For long, infinitely long and agonizing hours, we trudged along the paved road, diving into the ditch whenever we heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, crawling back onto the hard pavement when we felt safe again, and continuing our march with aching feet. Our socks were out, blisters formed on our toes and heels, and the skin began to peel off our feet. We stumbled through endless pitch-black nights, passing French posts and farmers on their way to Le Mans, feeding on tomatoes we found in front gardens or whatever we pulled from the refuse pile of a slaughterhouse. During the days, we slept deeply buried in leaves and small woods or in thickets, always on the alert, restless, ever ready to be discovered and recaptured. By the end of the third night, we finally reached the western outskirts of Le Mans. We cleaned our clothes, shaved in a park, and then ventured cautiously and with utmost vigilance into the city center. Hunger pangs tormented us as we passed the bakery and inhaled the aroma of freshly baked bread. We found the main train station without asking. I read the train departure times and found that the night express to Paris was the best option to get out of the danger zone. It was the same train we had used in better times when we were still the victors. We shook off the memories, left the city center, searched in vain for a protective shelter, and eventually hid, lacking anything better, in a bed of nasturtiums. Sleep was out of the question. Hunted and hungry, the tension kept us wide awake. After nightfall, we hesitantly stepped into the street, limped with sore feet clumsily through the old town of Le Mans, and advanced from the freight yard into the immediate vicinity of the main station, where darkness and parked freight cars made it easier to sneak onto the platform. At 1:07 a.m., the express train from Brest arrived at the station. A leap from our hiding place, a few large strides through the darkened freight yard, then onto the platform and into the crowd of excited passengers, which swept us like a wave into the Pullman cars. Shortly thereafter, a jolt, and the train slowly pulled out of Le Mans. We found ourselves wedged between chatting, laughing passengers. Others were asleep on the floor. I whispered to Fred to assume the same position. I hoped that the conductor would not bother to wake us up and ask for a ticket we did not have. But then the official appeared at the front of the car and called out in a sonorous voice, "Vos billets, mesdames, messieurs." I immediately crouched down and signaled Fred to follow my example. But Fred had his own will. He suddenly turned around and disappeared into the next car. As expected, the conductor passed the sleeping passengers undisturbed, and soon I heard his voice fading away in the rear of the train. Then I waited for Fred to return. I waited in vain. It was a beautiful, clear Saturday morning, the first day of September of 1945. The express train slowly pulled into Montparnasse station in Paris. It was exactly 7 a.m. I stood like a rock among the outgoing passengers on the platform, searching for Fred. The platform was deserted. My attempt to squeeze through the gate with the last passengers failed. It was the end of my freedom. A ticket inspector engaged me in a question and answer game. A gendarme probed further. I tried to make him believe the old story of stolen luggage, but had little luck. Suddenly, I found myself surrounded by uniforms. A lightning-fast reaction, and I fled with bleeding feet through Paris. The agony demanded my pace. After a brief chase through the streets where I had once walked with Marguerite, I was cornered. I was captured again, and since I preferred my status as a prisoner of war over that of a common criminal, I admitted to having escaped from the La Flèche camp. The effect of my confession was as expected. Amid the applause of the gendarmes, I was stripped and shoved into a windowless cell. In response to my request for a French officer, a corporal appeared. He allowed me to put on my clothes but not my shoes, handcuffed me and motioned with his unholstered pistol for me to step out into the street and walk ahead of him. Barefoot, I traversed the city where I had spent so many happy hours. Memories surged up like lava from a volcano. With a quick sidelong glance, I caught the furtive looks of Parisians with their light summer dresses, which made my situation seem even more miserable. With an energetic shake of my head, I dismissed these thoughts. Again, I felt the barrel of the pistol in my back and followed the corporal's instruction with the awareness that I had reached the lowest rung of my life's ladder. From now on, things could only go up. We descended into the cool vaults of the metro, traveled through the underground labyrinth to Gare du Nord, boarded a suburban train which we left at Cormeilles-en-Parisis, and marched through a sunlit landscape that looked like a Monet painting up the slope of a hill where the grim fort Cormeilles finally rose. Another body search, another interrogation. I refused to give the sergeant any information and insisted on my right to be interrogated by an officer. The sergeant, however, adhered to a different interpretation of the Hague Conventions. I was thrown headfirst into an underground dungeon. It had no window, no bed, no chair. I groped around in the darkness, found a pile of straw, and immediately fell into a deep sleep. Later, how much later I don't know, I was awakened and dragged out of the cell by two soldiers. They dragged me through numerous corridors, through casemates that smelled like morgues, into a room. There, an Alsatian sergeant offered me a deal. A glass of water for a full confession. Thirsty, I agreed. But the truth did not please the sergeant. With flowery language he described the consequences of such a bundle of lies: indefinite solitary confinement and the revocation of all privileges. However, he emphasized that there was another solution. Officers with my training and background were in high demand in the Foreign Legion. As a volunteer, I could be a free man in 4 weeks, sharing the fine food, daily red wine and talented prostitutes of Sidi Bel Abbé with other legionnaires. I made it clear that he could keep the prostitutes, the wine and the food for himself, that I was not his man. He smiled maliciously and gave me enough time to thoroughly consider my hasty decision. Soon after, the cell door closed behind me once again. Night surrounded me, hunger consumed me, but the darkness was a blessing. It spared me from seeing the vermin that infested my cell. For hours, for days, I lived in a state of deep trance, haunted by the sergeant's advice to reconsider. My prospects were bleak. As things stood, there was no way for me to escape from this fortress. I had to outwit the walls to find a way to the outside world. When the guard carried me out of the cell, I told the sergeant, "I'll sign, you've won." He put on his malicious smile again and ordered a soldier to bring me something to eat. Fortified with goulash, white bread and coffee, I pledged my life to the Foreign Legion. What I once believed only happened in novels, I now experienced myself, fully aware of my desperate situation. I signed, was examined, declared fit for duty, and sworn into the tricolore. In return, the sergeant promised me a swift transfer to another camp where I could prepare for service in the Legion. But my departure was delayed by a severe case of dysentery, which confined me to the fort's infirmary for a week. For several days my life hung by a thread. Only my will to escape contributed to my remarkably rapid recovery. On September the 28th, my possessions were unexpectedly returned to me, but instead of my neutral suit, I was handed a shabby labor service uniform. I was reminded once again that a new power was thinking and caring for me. A corporal guarded me on the train journey from Cormeilles-en-Parisis to Paris and from there to Le Mans in an unknown camp. As a new legionnaire, I was anything but free. In fact, my situation was quite opaque. For 2 days I was a prisoner in the heavily guarded prison within the camp, sharing a cell with an army officer. On Monday morning, I was brought to the camp commander. He warned me very correctly that as a future legionnaire, I was subject to the laws of the Legion. Another attempt to escape would inevitably result in a court-martial and a death sentence. However, if I adhered to my oath, I would be picked up by Legion officers within a few weeks, and nothing would stand in the way of a new, glorious career under the French flag. On October the 1st, I was released into an officer's cage located in the middle of the camp. Here, I encountered some of the La Flèche prisoners who had been relocated here for security reasons. The Le Mans camp, especially the officer's cage, was considered escape-proof. Although I had lost almost 30 pounds, I began that very evening to look for escape opportunities. High fences, complex barbed wire entanglements, and vigilant guards made the search difficult. Day after day, I spent many hours studying the routines of the guards in the towers and at the double fences that separated our cage from the French troops' accommodations. On cool nights, I climbed over fences into other cages to identify the weakest point of the camp. My search for an escape route became all the more urgent as the day of my transfer to Africa and Sidi Bel Abbé approached. On October the 13th, my luck seemed to rise like a comet. The French administration handed me a package from the International Red Cross, which I had signed for at the Fort Cormeilles infirmary. The package suddenly made me a wealthy man: cheese, biscuits, concentrated foods, and best of all, 4 packs of American cigarettes and a tin of tobacco. I now had valuable goods that I could trade for civilian clothing. But an even more valuable development occurred 2 days later. During a routine reconnaissance trip to the adjacent infirmary, I met a German medical student who accompanied our most severe cases to the Le Mans hospital. When he asked if I had anything to sell, I considered it another link in my chain of fortune and offered him my wristwatch. We agreed on a price, and then the watch, which I had worn throughout the war and smuggled through many searches, changed hands. The student promised me 1,000 francs, which he would hand over through the fence the next evening. For a full day, I doubted the student's honesty and was pleasantly surprised when he, as promised, handed me a bundle of francs through the mesh wire. The amount was correct. With a wink, he noted that the bundle would be enough for a ticket to the German border. While I carefully bargained for my travel clothes, my escape plan slowly took concrete shape. My fellow prisoners were particularly fond of my American cigarettes, and I bought a leather bag for my meager belongings and even meagerer travel provisions for 6 cigarettes. A dark grey winter coat cost me 10 cigarettes, a hat and a shirt only 3. My biggest expense was 20 cigarettes and my treacherous brown uniform for an inconspicuous blue suit. But my fellow prisoner Horst Bender still wore the repurposed naval uniform that covered his thin frame. He alone had my complete trust, and he was the only one I asked to help me on the night of my escape. Finally, I needed a number of butcher hooks. I bartered 10 hooks for 10 cigarettes with a young prisoner who worked in our cage. I told him I needed the hooks for the clothes rack. In reality, I needed them to overcome the light barbed wire entanglement of a less well-lit section of the enclosure between the camp kitchen and the French accommodations. I reviewed my escape plan hourly, planned every movement, every step in advance, and considered every possible surprise. I spent many hours in the dark autumn nights in the shadows of the trees near the fences. I was determined to rather die fighting than share the red wine and prostitutes with the legionnaires in Sidi Bel Abbé. I scheduled my escape for 10 p.m. on October the 27th. At this hour, the moon would not yet have risen. Saturday, October the 27th. The morning roll call went off as usual without incident. The thought that the camp would be in bright turmoil in 24 hours put me in the best of spirits. I spoke one last time with all the men I knew. It was my way of saying goodbye. In the afternoon, my tension mounted. I repeatedly gave Horst Bender final instructions for the role he was to play in my nocturnal drama. While the prisoners slurped their evening soup, I bundled up the winter coat and leather bag in the shadow of a tree in the deserted courtyard, handed Horst Bender the bundle, and then positioned myself in the dim light of a flickering lantern near the small guardhouse. There stood the cart with the empty soup cans that were delivered to our cage every evening. It was a chilly and cool night. Dressed in my work uniform, I waited impatiently for the appearance of the work detail. Shortly after 8 p.m., a few men appeared, grabbed the wheel spokes and began pushing the handcart out of our cage. One jump, and I was with them, gripping the spokes firmly and pushing and shoving the vehicle through the gate across the camp road and through the enclosure of the camp kitchen. Under the cover of darkness, I slipped into the latrine. I hid until the evening strollers in the cage had left the courtyard. Then I stepped into the pitch-black night and approached the fence. A shadowy figure detached itself from a tree. It was Horst Bender. A bundle flew over the nearby fence into my outstretched arms. I hurried back to the latrine, unpacked the bundle, took off my brown uniform and put on Bender's blue suit. Then I tied up the work uniform, crept quietly to the fence and threw the package into the hands of my half-naked accomplice. In exchange, he threw my bag with the winter coat over the high wire. Then a white hand waved in the dark night. It was the last I ever saw of him. A few jumps to the double barbed wire entanglement. I lay flat in the leaves. Before me loomed the nearly insurmountable tangle of the enclosure. On the other side of the double wire entanglement stood the guardhouse of the French troops. Some spruces and pines on either side of the enclosure, illuminated by the arc lamps, cast ghostly shadows. For long, anxious seconds, I lay motionless as a sentry patrolled along the outer fence, just a few meters away from me. Then there was silence again. I bundled some of the bottom wires of the inner fence with 2 hooks, took a quick glance at the guardhouse, then at the 2 towers to the right and left, and slipped through the obstacle, pushing my bundle of clothes ahead of me, crawling along the shadow of a pine tree that stretched across the no-man's land, reached the barbed wire roll, carefully hung it with 2 hooks on the outer fence, slipped underneath it, bundled some wires of the outer fence with the last hooks, then 2 or 3 pushes, and I had overcome the tangle. In the shadow of the guardhouse, I stood up, took a deep breath, threw on the winter coat, pulled the hat over my sweat-drenched hair, tucked the leather bag under my left arm, struck a cigarette between my lips and, keeping a vigilant eye around me, walked into the camp of the French soldiers. Initially hesitating, I soon walked briskly and decisively across the parade ground. Suddenly, a group of soldiers emerged from the darkness. I stopped, lit the cigarette, took a puff or two and exhaled a white cloud into the night air. Cautiously and without looking back, I put one foot in front of the other, marched across the square, between the barracks, crossed the busy camp road and disappeared after endless minutes into the darkness of the unlit part of the French accommodations. One last fence was quickly overcome, and then the moon rose in the pale night sky. Smoking, I entered the country road leading to Le Mans and marched towards the large light in the west. With an uneasy feeling in my stomach, I let a few vehicles pass. I reached the city undisturbed, crossed a suburb and arrived at the main station at 11:10 p.m. My nerves underwent a new test when I had to buy a second-class ticket to Paris for some of my notes. 2 hours later, on Sunday, October the 28th, I boarded the express train to Paris as a legitimate passenger and took a corner seat in a smoky compartment. Precisely at 7 a.m. again, the train arrived at Montparnasse station. With a feeling of immense relief, I handed over my ticket at the passage counter, brushed past the gendarme who had arrested me 2 months earlier, and took the metro to Gare de l'Est. I oriented myself regarding the trains to the German border, chose a night express to Metz, and bought a second-class ticket. 37 hours of waiting lay ahead of me, 780 minutes that could turn disastrous. In great anxiety, but outwardly composed, I traversed the underground Paris in the metro, strolled through familiar streets and boulevards, felt the eyes of all passers-by on me, and braced myself to be asked for papers by a gendarme, which I of course did not possess. But I managed to endure the hours of increasing hunger and thirst with composure. In my restlessness, I returned to the station far too early. On the platform, there were neither gendarmes nor military patrols, and I had enough time to choose a comfortable compartment where I squeezed into a corner, completely exhausted. The 9-hour journey to Metz brought me to the brink of exhaustion. For 2 days and 2 nights, I had been without sleep, constantly pursued by the feeling of being recognized. In Metz, I locked myself in a washroom, shaved off my incriminating beard, and then paced restlessly in front of the departure board, deciding on a train to French-occupied Saarbrücken. I bought a new ticket to the border town of Forbach and planned to continue my journey to Germany as soon as darkness would provide cover for my escape over the border. Again, I stepped out into the street. I was dazed and my stomach ached unbearably. I was at the end of my strength. I needed sleep, but I dared not risk falling asleep. I was hungry, but I hesitated to enter a shop. I was thirsty, but caution kept me from drinking from a faucet. Yet, eventually, the confidence in my luck which had helped me thus far prevailed. Carefully, I entered a bakery, mumbling that I had forgotten my bread cards and was served by a refreshingly plump girl. I wandered through the old town and wolfed down the 2 crispy long loaves, but the warm bread only made me hungrier. I made another attempt, this time in a restaurant, and my request for a lunch without coupons was met with a winning smile from the landlady. Naively, she served me a plate of pea soup, Lyon sausage with potato salad, and for dessert, rice pudding, a heavenly treat. After this hearty meal, I resumed my restless wandering. After nightfall, at 6:45 p.m., I returned to the station. Convinced that a strict border control was to be expected in Forbach, I searched the waiting train for a safe hiding place. The darkness concealed the poorly lit platform, but the old high-wheeled passenger cars were suited for everything but an escape. As I reached the locomotive, the idea struck me like a bolt of lightning. The locomotive was unmanned. A quick decision, a leap onto the tender, and I lay flat on a heap of dusty coal. Only moments later, the driver and fireman returned. They handled levers and wheels, then the whistle shrieked, and the train slowly left the Metz station. After 2 hours, the fireman had gotten dangerously close to my hiding place. Cautiously, I crawled to the end of the tender, found a large toolbox, opened the lid, took out a hose, climbed in, and closed the lid again, leaving a small crack. I did it just in time. The brakes squealed, the train slowed, and with a jolt, it stopped at Forbach station. Noise, clanging of weapons, commotion. A detachment of French troops swarmed the cars, climbed onto the roofs, illuminated the axles. Then I heard voices. I immediately closed the lid. I felt the locomotive being uncoupled from the next car. Then it suddenly snorted away. A few hissing piston strokes and the machine came to a stop. The noise revealed that it was taking on fresh water. Again, footsteps. The lid of the box was ripped open, and I looked into the sooty faces of the driver and fireman, illuminated by the dim light of a lantern. Complete surprise, stammered questions. I answered in French, murmuring an apology that seemed to satisfy them, that I wanted to visit friends on the other side of the border, and suddenly found myself facing an inexplicable human reaction. Instead of handing me over to the French soldiers, they merely forbade me from using their locomotive any further. With a quick turn, I jumped off the machine, slipped into the darkness, snuck into the goods yard, hid under a cattle wagon, and waited. The soldiers abandoned their search for escaped prisoners of war and withdrew into the station building. The locomotive steamed, moved backwards, was coupled to the first car, and then slowly pulled the small train out of the Forbach station. I emerged from my hiding place, ran across the tracks, climbed onto the buffer of the baggage car, climbed a thin swaying ladder onto the roof, and lay flat. The train swayed and groaned through the night. I felt neither the cold nor the stinging smoke in my face. Somewhere was the German border, and Germany lay ahead of me. I lay on my back and stared up at the clear starry sky. Then lights appeared. I let myself slide down the swaying ladder onto the buffer and waited. A squeal, a jerk, and the train stopped at the Saarbrücken station. I jumped onto the platform. French troops were everywhere. Passengers streamed out of the compartments. I quickly mingled with the arrivals. 2 German railway officials stood at the exit. I approached one of them and whispered, "I need help. I escaped from a camp." The man nodded, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into the darkness. "Come with me," he simply said. "Pretend you're one of us." Then he led me across the pitch-black goods yard to an abandoned Pullman car. A knock and the door was opened. A sharp beam of light, 2 hands quickly pulled me into the spacious interior of the car. With a slam, the door closed. As I washed the soot off my face and hands, the two officials showered me with questions. I answered them while simultaneously downing a portion of hot fried potatoes with ersatz coffee. Their help and concern were comforting. They advised me to leave the danger zone as quickly as possible and to use the next American D train from Paris to my further escape. The train was scheduled to arrive at midnight and would continue its journey to Frankfurt with a German locomotive and German personnel from there. The moment for renewed action came with express train speed. With a lantern in hand, pretending to be an assistant, I followed my two benefactors back to the platform. At that moment, the D train from Paris pulled into the station. American military policemen jumped out and illuminated the axles of the sleeping cars with long-handled flashlights. The locomotive was swapped out and the express train was ready for departure. On edge, I stood between my helpers next to the locomotive, ready to jump. Everything around me, the puffing of the locomotive, the noise of the military policemen speaking in French, commands in English, felt like knife blows piercing me. Suddenly, a loud creaking. The locomotive began to move. I shook hands with my helpers and jumped onto the moving engine. Then, 12 piston strokes and the express train rolled out of the station into the darkness, away from the border, away from danger, deeper and deeper into Germany. As the sky in the east slowly turned purple, the train clattered across the Mainz bridge over the Rhine and continued eastward, ever eastward. When the first rays of the sun touched the treetops of a pine forest south of Frankfurt, I knew I was free. At 6:40 a.m. on Tuesday, October 30th, 1945, the train came to a stop at a signal. I jumped from the locomotive and disappeared into the woods of my youth. Home. Herbert has finally made it. The war is over and he is back in Germany. What an incredible story he has told, from his youth in the German countryside, then joining the Kriegsmarine in 1939, going to sea from 1941 until the end of the war in 1945, and then being a POW for almost 6 months. All of this culminated in his James Bond-like escape attempts until he successfully escaped. You would not believe this man's life story if it was fiction, but it truly happened this way. This episode also gives a glimpse into the chaos that followed the unconditional surrender of Germany in May of 1945. Nowadays, almost everyone thinks that as long as you were taken prisoner on the Western Front, life was easy. Well, I can tell you that suddenly having to care for about 2 million POWs is no easy feat. And while conditions certainly were better in the West, a lot of people died in the POW camps. Research varies considerably, ranging from about 20,000 deaths up to around 1 million. I suggest you do your own research, especially when it comes to the so-called Rheinwiesen camps. But, at least in the West, POWs were released relatively quickly. In the East, the final batch of prisoners was only released in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. One of my own grandfathers was released in 1949 from the Eastern Front. The other was lost in the war, as we say. As for Herbert, he actually moved to America in 1957 and lived there happily ever after, finally joining his crew in the sky in April of 2013 at the ripe old age of 92. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching and or listening, and I will do a more detailed book report in a separate video. Until then, let me know what you think in the comments, and I will hopefully see you in the next story. Cheers.